See, geopolitics is a very cruel business, very cruel business. You know, in most businesses, if you don't do well, you lose money, you go bankrupt, you carry on. Life carries on. In geopolitics, you do badly, the likelihood is that a war starts and many people die.
大家好，我是老吴，今天和大家分享一下马凯硕最近的一次演讲。我的频道里关于他的节目是最多的，因为我非常喜欢他，并且在之前的一期节目中专门谈了一下我对他的看法。为了方便同样喜欢马凯硕的朋友们，我将频道中所有关于他的节目做成了一个播放列表，名字就叫马凯硕专辑，有兴趣的朋友们可以去看看。我们刚才听到的片头来自今年6月的一场线上讲座，这是马凯硕为印尼一家智库做的，听众主要是亚洲的年轻学者和学生。我觉得这次演讲和他之前在很多西方场合的演讲或者访谈很不一样，它更像是一堂给亚洲学生的公开课，所以讲的也很坦率、很直接、很亲切。他整个演讲的逻辑布局非常清晰，就像一堂精心设计的课程。首先，他从地缘政治的残酷本质讲起，解释了为什么人必须要重视它。接着，他用当前欧洲的冲突作为案例，深刻地剖析了地缘政治处理不好会带来多么灾难性的后果。然后，他把焦点转向了当今世界最重要的地缘政治冲突，也就是中美博弈。最后，他还特别为东南亚国家提出了在夹缝中生存的智慧和建议。好，我们就正式进入马凯硕这堂地缘政治课。
And unfortunately, geopolitics seems to be ingrained into human nature because it has been around for 2,000 years plus. And there's some iron laws of geopolitics that have been around for 2,000 years that we thought that now that we are so clever, so well educated, we are liberated from the laws of geopolitics. Sadly, we are not, as I will document, you see. And the remarkable thing is that until recently, people thought, well, you know what, there will always be a few conflicts here and there, but by and large, the trend line will be downwards, right? The geopolitics will diminish and the world will become a safer and safer place. But instead, as you can tell, I mean, from your gut feeling, I'm sure you can tell that it's becoming a more dangerous world. And I hope I'll try to explain to you why it's a more dangerous world. And I also want to begin by saying that what is strange about the world of today is that mistakes about geopolitics are not just being made by, the poor developing countries. And everyone says, okay, they're poor, they're developing, so what can you expect? They make mistakes, right? But I can tell you that certainly one of the biggest wars that is happening in the world today is a result of a geopolitical failure, not by poor developing countries, but by some of the smartest and most sophisticated countries in the world. And here I'm referring to the European Union, So it's shocking that the European Union, which has, the people of the European Union enjoy a wonderful standard of living, high levels of education, supposedly competent leaders, and yet they are behaving. They're responsible for a major war that is happening in the world today, which is Ukraine war. Now, you must be surprised by that. Surely you all read in the papers that the Ukraine war is a result of Russia invading Ukraine. It's true. The Ukraine war is also a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's also true, because anytime under international law, when a big power invades a small country, it is a violation of international law. But wars also happen because of geopolitical incompetence. And here, the geopolitical incompetence was generated by as I say, one of the most sophisticated organizations in the world, the European Union. And I'll explain how they did so. And by the way, I'm not having any PowerPoints, but if you want to get more information on the point, I'll point to you to some sources. And by the way, just for your information, one of my books, which discusses some of these issues, is a free book. You can access it for free. It's called The Asian 21st Century. When it was launched in 2022, the publisher, German publisher, expected 20,000 downloads of the book. Instead of 20,000 downloads of the book, there have been 4 million downloads in 160 countries. So I point that out to you because the world in some ways is preparing for the Asian century. And one reason why they're preparing for the Asian century is also because the West is making serious mistakes at this point in time. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Exhibit A is Ukraine. So what was the basic mistake made by the European Union? Very simple mistake. When you live next to a great power, and Russia is a great power, you must understand that every great power has got security concerns, right? They want to protect themselves. And the way they protect themselves is by ensuring that no hostile force is planted near their borders. And by the way, if you want the best historical example of this, you just have to look at what happened during the time of President John F. Kennedy, when the then Soviet Union wanted to plant missiles in Cuba next to the United States of America. The United States of America said, no way, you cannot plant missiles close to my borders. If you do, I'll start a war. And incidentally, you should all study the Cuban episode of 1962, 1963, because that's when the world came closest to having a nuclear war, right? And, as you know, in a nuclear war, and a nuclear war can result, if you have bad geopolitics, you will see that as a result of a bad geopolitics, you can have a nuclear war happen to you also. And that, by the way, means the end of the world, the end of humanity. And this is why you have to pay attention to geopolitics. As I said, in business, you go bankrupt, you carry on. In geopolitics, you have wars, you lose lives. In the worst case scenario, nuclear war, everybody dies. That's why geopolitics is important. And I gave you an example of how that almost happened in 1960. Now, we used to think, in those days, the people were not so clever. This is 2025. They are much more clever. And guess what? We also brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war in the 2020s. And this happened because the European states didn't try to understand the security concerns of Russia and continued to expand NATO. And NATO is a hostile force to Russia. They continued to expand NATO eastwards towards Russia. And what was terrible about this is that the West kept on doing this, even though the West had promised Russia that it would not expand NATO, right? And what is amazing about the Ukraine war is that 25 or 26 years ago, in the year 1999, 26 years ago, a great American thinker called George Kennan. And George Kennan was the man who masterminded the Cold War strategy for United States. He was a brilliant strategic thinker. And he said 26 years ago, he says, why are we expanding NATO? why are we pushing NATO closer to the Russia? He says, if you do that, you'll get the Russians very angry. And when the Russians get angry, they will react against you, right? They will launch a military invasion, and then you'll blame the Russians, right? And you know the West is blaming the Russians, right? But 26 years ago, they were warned, right? Explicitly warned. You should not expand NATO. So, and by the way, if you want more facts on this, there are two professors, two American professors who have spoken a lot about the subject. One is Professor John Mearsheimer from the Chicago University. You can Google his lecture on the origins of the Ukraine war has been watched 40 million times. 40 million times. So it's a very persuasive lecture. And then you can also listen to another American professor, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. And these two professors give you all the information on how the Ukraine war could have been avoided if the West had been wiser, right? Now, what is shocking is that the most advanced societies have made this mistake. And what is really terrible about this mistake that has been made by the Europeans, I mean, I got to emphasize that the push to expand NATO came, of course, primarily from the United States, and the United States was trying to expand its sphere of influence, which is what great powers do. But the Europeans could have been wiser, and the Europeans could have told the Americans, this is not wise. You should not corner Russia. You should not put Russia in a position that it will lead to a war in Ukraine, right? The Europeans could have prevented it. So why didn't the Europeans do so? And I can tell you that one reason for this is that the Europeans have become incompetent. And don't take my word for it. You know, another great strategic thinker of the 20th century who just passed away recently was the great American strategic thinker, Henry Kissinger. I had the pleasure of getting to know him. I think Ibu Bella mentioned that I was in New York. So when I was serving as Singapore's ambassador to New York, I got to know Henry Kissinger. And I went to see him for my last one-on-one conversation in October 2022, about a year before he died. He died in October 2023 at the age of 100. And I remember in my conversation with him, I asked him about the Ukraine war, and he made it very clear that one reason why the Ukraine war happened was because the quality of mind of European leaders has been going down. They were not thinking long-term and strategically about the world. And they could have easily anticipated the Russian reaction, but they didn't anticipate it. And as a result of it, you had this cruel war happening in Ukraine, right? So that's why I want to emphasize to you, the first point I want to emphasize to you is that geopolitics is a very cruel game, and therefore you have to understand it well, because if you don't understand it well, your country can get caught in wars. And this is especially true for Asian countries, because I'm going to switch now. My first point was about Ukraine war and how it could have been avoided. My second point is that the biggest geopolitical contest that has broken out in human history is breaking out in our region. And why is that so? Because the number one geopolitical contest in the world is always between the world's number one power, which today is the United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, right? And as you know, China has become stronger and stronger. I mean, it's amazing how fast China has grown. Incidentally, China's growth has been remarkable. I mean, let me just give you one statistic. In the year 2000, the United States economy was 8 times bigger than China's economy. 8 times bigger. Now the US economy is only 1.5 times bigger. Only 1.5 times. And clearly, the Americans feel threatened by the rise of China. And there's an iron law of geopolitics. I mentioned to you earlier that geopolitics has been around for 2,000 years, right? There's an iron law of geopolitics that when the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's number one power will push down the world's number one emerging power. And that's exactly what's happening in this contest between US and China. And incidentally, I did write a book called Has China Won, which gives you more details on how that happened and why that happened. Now, of course, if you listen to American commentators, they will always say, we are not against the Chinese people. We are only against the Chinese Communist Party. Because the Chinese Communist Party, is evil, it suppresses its people, and of course it is not democratic, and that's why we are opposed to it. Now, I can tell you, by the way, the other very important thing I must tell you about geopolitics is that the biggest lies are told in geopolitics. I'm not exaggerating. The biggest lies are always told in geopolitics. And I can tell you this, if tomorrow China became a vibrant liberal democracy, but continue growing, United States will still push it down, even if it's a democracy, because it is not about democracy, it's about who is number one and who is number two. And it's amazing, In theory, we human beings are smart, sophisticated people. We're not supposed to behave like animals in the jungle. But in geopolitics, it's about jungle animal instincts. It's about who's number one or who's number two. And therefore, you have this incredible impulse in the United States to push down China. And what's remarkable, incidentally, as you all know, United States today is a deeply divided country, very badly divided country. And as you know, the Democrats and Republicans don't agree on anything, nothing, except one thing. It's time to push down China. And you can see, for example, right? You remember in 2018, when Donald Trump was president in his first term, he launched tariffs against China, right? That's how the geopolitical contest broke out. At first in a trade war. And United States was trying to slow down China's growth by imposing tariffs. And it's interesting, when Joe Biden was the presidential candidate in 2019, he criticized Donald Trump. He said, you know what? What President Trump has done is wrong. These tariffs will not hurt the Chinese. These tariffs will hurt the American people. And therefore, this tariff should be removed. Joe Biden said this as a presidential candidate. And then he became president. And what did he do? Did he remove the tariffs? No. Even though he had criticized the tariffs, he didn't remove the tariffs. Why? Because when he became president, he said, okay, it's also my job to make sure that China doesn't overtake us, right? And indeed, Joe Biden is a very honest man. He says, that China wants to grow its economy and become the number one economy in the world. And Joe Biden said, this is the exact words he used. He says, ain't gonna happen on my watch. I can tell you, no American president wants to be the president who led America to becoming the number 2 position. So every American president will want to keep the number 1 position and keep up the pressure on China. And that's why Trump started it, Biden continued it, Biden left, Trump came back, the geopolitical contest carries on. So it's nothing to do with personalities. Personalities are irrelevant. The president's name can be President X, but he will do what the geopolitical imperative says, which is to push down your competitor. But at the same time, I must say that you will also find that geopolitics is a very complex business. And I say, while the personalities don't matter in the sense that the contest will carry on, how the contest is carried out can change depending on the personality. So, for example, in theory, since President Trump, as you know, is a much stronger, more assertive president than Joe Biden. And Joe Biden is a very nice guy. I mean, and by the way, incidentally, I want to mention parenthetically that Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping actually became good friends. When they were vice presidents, they were good friends. Xi Jinping visited the United States as vice president. Joe Biden hosted him. Joe Biden visited China as vice president. Xi Jinping hosted him. They became good personal friends. But guess what? Despite their personal friendship, relations became worse between US and China. And the contest continued. Again, another example how personalities in that sense don't matter. But in any case, President Trump has been elected. Now, so one would expect that because President Trump is more assertive, things will get more difficult. But surprisingly, as you can see, President Trump is also by nature a deal maker. So this is surprising. In theory, relations should get worse between US and China because Biden is a nice guy. Trump, as you know, is not a nice guy. Biden is a softie. Trump is a very, very brash, very assertive, very strong. But yet, surprisingly, it is conceivable that relations between US and China might be more stable in Trump 2.0. And that's also, by the way, partly a result of the fact that China has also become much stronger in the intervening years. As I told you, the contest started in 2018. We're now in 2025. 7 years have passed. In the first round, China tried its best to be nice to the United States and to say, okay, let's try and compromise and settle. This time, as you know, China has been very tough and said, no, if you push me, if you put tariffs on me, I'll put tariffs on you. You block my exports, I'll block exports to you. I'll block exports of minerals. And you can see as a result of partly because of Trump wanting to be a deal maker, partly because of China's strong stance. Surprisingly, there might be a deal in the coming weeks between US and China. Surprisingly. And when in theory, there should not be such a deal. But I also want to add another important point here, that as the US and China, and the contest will get fiercer and fiercer, we in the rest of the world will be affected by it also. And especially we in ASEAN. I know many of you come from the ASEAN countries, and of all the regions in the world that will feel the effect of this contest most strongly, ASEAN will be one of the regions. and there'll be pressure on ASEAN countries to take sides in this contest, which is why one of the very important messages I want to convey to you all is that we 10 countries in ASEAN, if we want to protect ourselves from the pressures coming from US and China, we must stick together. Because if we are, as you know, there's a famous saying, united we are strong, divided we fall. That can happen to the ASEAN countries, the 10 ASEAN countries. We can disagree on some things, we may have disagreements on some issues, but when it comes to the US-China contest, we must all say the same thing, which is what we've been saying so far, that ASEAN wants to be friends with the United States, and ASEAN wants to be friends with China, and we don't want to take sides. Now, if we took this position individually as countries, we'd be subject to lots of pressure. But if we combine together as a group, then we are protected to some extent from this contest. And I must say, the good thing is that so far, the ASEAN countries have been quite good at working together to handle the US-China contest. And if you think, if you think, am I serious that actually US and China would apply pressure on ASEAN countries to take sides? Let me give you a concrete example, right? And I want to point to one country, which is not a small country. In fact, this country is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. This country is the United Kingdom, right? Now, the United Kingdom is a very powerful country, right? Its economy is among the top 10 economies in the world. It has nuclear weapons. 100 years ago, the sun didn't set on the British Empire. The British could run the world effortlessly. They're a very powerful country. But you know what happened? I'll tell you a true story. In January 2020, right, just before COVID, I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum meeting. And I was speaking to a group of CEOs from all over the world. But before the meeting, I was talking to my fellow panelists, who was a very senior British gentleman. And in 2020, UK was under pressure from the United States to stop using Huawei. As you know, Huawei is this Chinese telecommunications company, and which the United States has been trying to push down, because any company that becomes strong in China, the United States will try to push down. So I asked this British gentleman, very senior gentleman, I said, what will the UK do? Will you be able to continue using Huawei? And the British gentleman said to me, Kishore, we, the British, we have planted our GCHQ people. Now, GCHQ stands for the Signals Intelligence People. As you know, all great powers spy through telecommunications and all that. So he said, we have planted our spies into Huawei. We have scrubbed the software of Huawei. We know what's going on in Huawei, so we will allow Huawei to continue in the UK. This British gentleman said to me. So I said, come on. The question is not technical. It is political. Can the British withstand pressure from the United States to get rid of Huawei? Right? January 2020. And this British gentleman got a bit upset with me. He said, Kishore, the United States needs the UK as much as UK needs the US. If we decide to stand firm, the US cannot do anything. You know what? You can go back and check, Google and check. He said that to me in January 2020. In June 2020, UK crumbled. In 6 months, UK crumbled and was forced to expel Huawei. Now, if a country like United Kingdom, strong, powerful, permanent member of the UN Security Council, can crumble under pressure from United States, you can imagine how much harder it is for other countries in the world to withstand pressure from the great powers. And I can tell you that the pressure on on ASEAN states will increase in this coming decade because the contest between US and China will accelerate. Now, I've already said that we, the ASEAN countries, must stick together, but I think we need to do more because there are countries all over the world that do not want to take sides in this US-China contest. Just last week, I was in Africa. In fact, I came back from Africa 24 hours ago. If I yawn during the lecture, it's because I still have jet lag from my flight from Nigeria. And a week before that, by the way, I was in Chicago. I can tell you that many countries around the world don't want to take sides. And so one thing that ASEAN can do is that ASEAN can spread the word to countries around the world and say, why don't we take a common position that we won't take sides in this contest? But equally importantly, and I will conclude with this point, it's an important point. It's important for us, the countries outside US and China, to remind the US and China that today the world has shrunk, right? As you all know that. The world has become a small and interdependent place. In fact, as I look at the screen, and as I can see that you're all coming from so many different countries, this screen is an example of how the world has shrunk. And one consequence of the world shrinking is that our fates are now intertwined. Let me explain that clearly by using a simple boat analogy. And again, this is another book that I wrote called The Great Convergence, in which I explain the boat analogy. Now, in the past, when 8 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? So each boat had a captain or crew to take care of it. Now, I can tell you that if humanity was still living in 193 separate boats, if one boat got COVID, the other boat would not get COVID because you're separated by distance, right? But as you know, as we saw recently with COVID, when one country got COVID, all 193 countries got COVID. So what does that mean? It means that 8 billion people no longer live in different boats. They all live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And that's why COVID spreads. We're on the same boat. Now, if you are on the same boat, does it matter whether you have a bigger cabin or smaller cabin if the boat begins to sink? If the boat begins to sink, surely everyone should get out of their cabins and take care of the boat as a whole. And this is the big argument that the younger generation people like you need to make to the older people, to remind them that in this small interdependent world, we have to take care of the common global challenges first. And we have many common global challenges. So that's why in my last chapter of my book, Has China Won? I point out the common interests that the United States and China have in many issues. For example, we need to fight pandemics like COVID. One country cannot fight it. We must all come together. We need to fight climate change. Climate change is going to damage lots of countries around the world. We need to fight global financial crisis. More will be coming, right? We need to fight global terrorist challenges. So there are all these challenges, common global challenges that we have to deal with. So that's why it's very important for the young people like you to remind the old people like me that, hey, we live in a world where there are many common global challenges. And because there are these many common global challenges, we should press the pause button on the geopolitical contest and focus instead on the common challenges. Now, believe me, if we had wise leaders around the world, this is exactly what they will be doing. But unfortunately, and this is the paradox here, that even though the West has been dominating the world for the last 200 years, today the West no longer has wise leaders, right? And that's why I began my lecture by talking about how Europe could have prevented the Ukraine war. But because they no longer have wise leaders, they could not prevent the Ukraine war. Similarly, the Europeans should be among those. The Europeans believe more than any other countries in the world that climate change is a real threat. So if climate change was a real threat, the Europeans should be trying to persuade both US and China to press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest and work together to fight climate change. But the European leaders don't have the courage to do so. Sadly, and indeed, and sadly, the European leaders have become sycophants of the United States of America. If you don't believe me, look at what the NATO Secretary General has done. Mark Rutte. Last week, he called President Trump a daddy. I mean, that's shocking. Shows a complete lack of dignity. But he seems to think that by being sycophantic, by being subservient, that's the answer. And actually, as you know, in human relationships, you can never have a proper friendship if one partner is a sycophant to the other partner. Friendships occur between equal partners where you can speak frankly to each other. And the Europeans can't do that. They have lost it. And that's also part of the problem that we face in the world today. So as a result of that, even though logically, as humanity becomes better educated, more rational, we should be seeing less and less geopolitical struggles in the world. Sadly, I can tell you that there'll be more and more geopolitical struggles in the world. Why? Because it goes back to geopolitics that has been around for 2,000 years. So I'm sorry that I have to give you this bad news, but I think it's important for you all to have a realistic understanding of geopolitics, because as I said to you all, geopolitics is a very cruel business. If we do it badly, we will have wars. And here I must say, and this is an important point for all of you who come from ASEAN to know, you should all be amazed that there has been no major war in the ASEAN region for 46 years. That's a miracle. It shows you how wise the ASEAN leaders have been. I mean, just look across nearby. Just a few months ago, there was a major flare-up between India and Pakistan, right? That could also happen here in Southeast Asia, but it hasn't happened. the fact that there has been no wars in Southeast Asia for 46 years is absolutely amazing. It shows you how wonderful ASEAN is. So what you need to do is preserve ASEAN, because if you don't preserve ASEAN, you will have within ASEAN wars like the ones you saw between India and Pakistan, wars like the one you saw between Israel and Iran, wars like the ones that you see in Gaza today. So if you want to prevent those situations, understand geopolitics and make sure that you respect geopolitics. Thank you.
好，马凯说的这堂课就到这里。我们来简单回顾一下。首先，他强调了地缘政治的重要性。他用欧洲的冲突为例，指出了即使是最发达的社会，一旦在地缘政治上犯下了无能之错误，后果也是灾难性的。接着，他剖析了中美博弈的本质。他认为这与意识形态无关，而是赤裸裸的权力竞争。守成大国必然会打压新兴大国。他强调，美国两党在这个问题上有着高度的共识。最后，他立足于东南亚，分享了东盟的生存智慧，那就是必须保持团结，坚持包容，不选边站队。他用英国在华为问题上短短6个月就崩溃的例子，说明单个国家在大国压力面前是多么脆弱。好，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家的收看，咱们下次再见。